I will always have a deep love for storytelling. I've devoted countless hours of my life trying to better understand how and why human beings create wonderful, beautiful lies to tell each other. Through film and literature, we can learn a lot about the human condition, and I study story, character, and theme to continue my never-ending education. But for me, like many, all of that started with a children's book about adventure, monsters, and imagination. Maurice Sendak had a problem. He couldn't draw horses. After deciding to write and draw his own children's books instead of illustrating for other authors, he found some success with his debut solo effort, Kenny's Window, in 1956. He thought his next book should be called Where the Wild Horses Are. It would be about a young boy who throws a tantrum, is sent to his room, and then escapes through the window to the land of equines. But again, he couldn't draw horses. So he discussed his illustrative shortcomings with his editor, Ursula Nordstrom. Inspired by an old Yiddish expression, wilde Chaya, which typically describes rambunctious children, Nordstrom suggested Sendak change the wild horses to more generic wild things. Sendak agreed and set about designing monsters based on his aunts and uncles, who would frequently pay visits to his childhood home in Brooklyn. On April 9, 1963, all 338 words of Where the Wild Things Are hit bookshelves across North America. However, you might be surprised to hear that initially, it was not well received.
And there was a big risk because as it was being done, people at the house already were shaking their heads. And the book was banned and it was terrible reviews. It became a very famous book, but it took about 2 years before librarians began to see that all the kids were taken out of the library over and over and over again.
As is often the case with success comes adaptation, and Where the Wild Things Are was no exception. The story found life in everything from animated shorts and piano compositions to operas.
It must be very fun.
It may have even inspired the title of a Metallica song. For a time, Disney owned the feature film rights to the property and had John Lasseter of Pixar fame use it as the subject of a short animation test, combining CGI backgrounds and traditionally animated characters. Eventually, the rights went to Universal, who began developing an all-CGI animated movie with veteran Disney animator Eric Goldberg at the helm. After a few years in development, though, it was decided that the film would be live action instead, and at Sendak's request, filmmaker Spike Jonze was brought on to direct.
It's almost been a film for like 16 to 18 years now. Various people who were interested in it, but those people who did not interest me. But then Spike came into my life. He is roughly the age I was when I did the book, and now he's doing his Where the Wild Things Are.
After a 6-year development and production cycle under Jonze, Where the Wild Things Are arrived in North American theaters on October 16, 2009. The film follows Max, an 8-year-old boy who's finding it hard to relate to the people in his life. His teenage sister is spending all her time with her friends, and his single mother is trying to date again. This leaves Max feeling very much alone, so he throws a tantrum one night and runs away. He discovers a boat on the edge of a pond, which he uses to sail away from his home, his family, and his troubles. After the pond magically becomes an ocean, Max ends up landing in a faraway land inhabited by large monsters with even larger problems. Their very small community is in discord because one of its members has left, so Max convinces the remaining wild things that he is a king with special powers that can bring their group together again. He and the wild things spend their days playing, fighting, and adventuring. But it soon becomes clear that this new life of freedom is no solution for either his nor the wild thing's problems. Max makes the decision to go home and finds his mother waiting on him there when he arrives. The film was met with a mostly positive critical reception, but a lukewarm box office. Because it was marketed more to adults than children, merchandising efforts were limited. However, Warner Brothers used their game publishing arm to crank out a video game adaptation of the film, which released October 13, 2009 to coincide with the limited New York opening of the movie. Where the Wild Things Are was developed by Kryptonite Games for the Sony PlayStation 3, Microsoft Xbox 360, and Nintendo Wii. Design duties were handed to SOCOM US Navy SEALs creator David Sears. Today, we'll be looking at the PlayStation 3 version. The game begins just as Max is arriving at the titular home of the Wild Things. Armed with a scepter found on the beach, the player takes control of the boy and leads him through the tutorial area, following one of the monsters to learn the basic mechanics of gameplay. Running and jumping, swinging and climbing, basic attacks, and power attacks. These are the fundamental skills that will guide the player through this low-impact adventure. After a strange pre-rendered cutscene presented in an oddball aspect ratio, the player finds themselves in the village of the Wild Things, where the odd-looking creatures contemplate eating Max. It is here that it becomes clear the game will deviate from Jones's film in much the same way that the film deviated from Sendak's book. After Max impresses his new cohort with his ferocity, they invite him to stay. Once the player is free to roam the village, the camera unlocks from its fixed position during the tutorial area. This is the only part of the game where the player has complete camera control, as it is the only space that is open for exploration. The player will find that the story levels are as linear as the tutorial area, but a return to the village after each mission allows the player to scratch that exploration itch. Roaming the village, Max will discover that each wild thing has a collectible to be gathered, and when certain benchmarks are reached, new features and areas will unlock. These mostly consist of cosmetic changes and small alcoves with more collectibles, as well as areas to practice fighting enemies. Some of these unlockables reveal new mechanics in the game. For example, the water fruit tree allows players to rapidly grow a variety of plants that can aid in exploration and level traversal. The concept is introduced in the village after a certain number of Judith's collectibles are obtained, but becomes more useful as the player works their way through the game proper. Eventually, Max is introduced to Carol, a prominent character in the film as well as the game. He takes Max into the island to further familiarize the player with the game's functions. Mild platforming challenges grow the player's skill in jumping and climbing, while easy combat encounters and environmental puzzles earn the character experience points. As Max collects XP orbs, his life meter grows, allowing him to take more hits before being defeated. This level is where the player learns that the Wild Things will also help Max get through areas. For instance, any large rock or tree that has holes in it can be punched by a Wild Thing to open up the path to continue. The most prominent enemy in the game is the Firefly. These flying insects come in a variety of flavors and are spawned from nests that Max can destroy. Some variants are naturally tougher than others, and later in the game provide an explosive element that must be utilized to blow up tougher nests or open up paths. Silver bugs tend to hang around climbing areas and will zap Max with electricity if he gets too close, resetting his progress. These enemies are difficult to defeat with normal attacks, but have an interesting weakness: purple fruit. Often, a purple fruit sapling will be in an area near impassable silver bugs, allowing the player to grow the plant using a nearby water fruit tree, thereby attracting the silver bugs away from where the player needs to go. Non-flying electrified insects called lightning bugs appear later on and provide opportunities to solve new environmental puzzles, as well as force the player to use different kinds of attacks to exploit their weakness. Before the first level is complete, a major story element emerges that hints at how different this adaptation will be from the film. As Max climbs across a collapsed bridge, the ground in the ravine below crumbles, revealing a black goo that reaches its tendrils out of the darkness, grabbing bugs and trees on the surface. Later in the game, this entity will manifest as a new enemy type, an arachnid-like creature that comes in spider and scorpion-shaped varieties. These present combat encounters where Max must defeat the creature while saving an accompanying wild thing from being sucked into the darkness. Most of the levels play just like this initial outing with Carol. Combat remains simplistic and platforming sections fairly rudimentary. A slight difficulty ramp in the back half of the game keeps things from getting too stale, but someone looking for a good challenge will likely just feel mild frustration at the game's tougher sections. For me, perspective was the big culprit here, and the locked camera angles did me no favors when trying to judge a tricky jump. The game also features a few on-rails running and boating sections that break up the action platforming levels. On an artistic front, Where the Wild Things Are is somewhat impressive. The lush environments are well rendered with a minimal heads-up display that disappears frequently to show the game's visuals unobscured by icons. Running in the Havoc engine, frame rate is the biggest inhibitor to the otherwise decent presentation. An acceptably smooth FPS is only achieved occasionally, but thankfully the slowdown doesn't ever really impact gameplay. The first half of the game begins to get a little samey, but by the end of this adventure, I was fairly impressed by the scale of some environmental elements. I was also pleased by a bit of psychedelic weirdness that falls right in line with the tone of the film. In fact, if anything, atmosphere is this game's biggest strength. Although a bold departure from Jones's film narratively, it nails that same sort of art house melancholy that makes the movie such a bittersweet exploration of nostalgic childhood reflection. The voice acting is terrific. Only Max Records reprises his role from the film, but other performers turn in decent impersonations, such as David Kaye and Allison Reed's takes on James Gandolfini and Catherine O'Hara, respectively.
Is this the only one?
Who cares? It's one too many.
Look what he did to our huts. Oh, he smashed all this? That's impressive.
The dialogue is a pitch-perfect facsimile of Spike Jonze and David Eggers' script. The Wild Things speak in matter-of-fact, stream-of-consciousness and often absurd proclamations, much like the manifestations of a child's subconscious might actually communicate.
Where does it hurt?
In the part of me covered by the outside.
The inside? That's bad.
The music by Kelly Logsdon is also appropriately ethereal and quite lovely overall. Leaning into percussion and wind instruments evokes the primitive and tribal lifestyle of the Wild Things, and some late-game tracks ramp up the weird ambience to match the narrative progression. As with other aspects of the game, the music is quite the departure from the wonderful indie folk film soundtrack by Karen O and the accompanying score by Carter Burwell. But that's not to say the game doesn't incorporate some elements from the movie. Ira's penchant for punching holes in trees carries over to one of the aforementioned mechanics.
I'm Ira. I put the holes in the trees. Maybe you saw those?
The owl characters Bob and Terry from the film are paid the slightest of nods as KW builds a purely cosmetic owl colony in the village if the player collects owl eggs. Carol's model city is also lifted from the movie and grows as Max collects pieces for him. The references aren't limited to the film either. Max's tent is modeled after the one in the book, and late in the game, a bit of Max's artwork subtly recalls one of Sendak's illustrations. While the lack of mechanical depth will certainly bore some players by the story's midpoint, I would argue that the breezy, repetitive gameplay falls more in line with the easygoing vibe of everything else Where the Wild Things Are has to offer. In fact, I think the game could actually benefit from some simplification. Trim down the amount of collectibles, scale back the combat encounters, and focus on platforming and exploration. As it stands, it's not a great game, but it's a decently effective experience, and at a playthrough time of about 5 hours, it certainly doesn't wear out its welcome. The final section of the game has Max and the Wild Things contending with impending doom as the moon threatens to crash to the Earth, recalling a similarly apocalyptic plot point from The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. In the most striking deviation from the book and film, the story ends with Max and his friends building a tower to the moon and resettling on the lunar surface to safely continue their days of play and adventure in space. But is this the definitive game adaptation of this film? Maybe not. Alongside the game that appeared on PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Wii, Where the Wild Things Are was separately developed for the Nintendo DS by WayForward Technologies. Although already prolific in the licensed game space, the studio was little known in 2009. It wouldn't be until later that they would get well-deserved recognition for their Shantae series and notable remasters such as DuckTales and A Boy and His Blob. In the DS version of the game, players once again take control of Max, but this time on a 2D playfield. Once more, the story takes a different path from all previous iterations. Instead of a scepter, you're armed with a powerful roar that can be customized with a recording via the DS's microphone.
Wow.
Fantastic. This roar ability incapacitates enemies, allowing you to pick them up and throw them like in Super Mario Bros. 2. Levels play out on multiple planes with Max jumping back and forth like in Virtual Boy Wario Land. Running, jumping, swinging, and crawling won't be enough to get you through these stages though, and that's where the Wild Things come in. Each of Max's friends has a unique wild ability that will help him conquer different obstacles, but before you can take advantage of these skills, the player must defeat the Wild Things in combat. The first half of the game has Max reunite the monsters over the course of 5 stages, each ending with a boss battle against a different Wild Thing. Along the way, you'll have to collect 5 power idols to bring back the sun, which the Wild Things believe has died. After the first 5 stages, let the Wild Rumpus start. This brief section allows the player to participate in 6 different minigames presented by each of the monsters. In my playthrough, I passed 1 and failed at 2 of the challenges before the story automatically continued, so I don't know if there's any benefit, much less any way, to actually complete all 6 challenges. Moving on to the last half of the game, we see Max return to different areas of previously explored levels. At first, these missions are to collect decorations for a fortress that the Wild Things are building, one of the few story elements lifted out of Jones's film. But after this task is done, a volcanic eruption destroys the fort Max and the Wild Things have worked so hard on. His friends run away in fright, so it is now up to Max to once again find the Wild Things, clear the island of lava rocks, collect power idols to stop the volcanoes, and defeat the lava beast who is causing all of this trouble in the first place. Although I found the 3D console version's simplicity to be something of a strength, I feel that its DS counterpart could benefit from a little more complexity. Utilizing the Wild Things' abilities to unlock previously inaccessible areas makes this feel awfully close to a Metroidvania-style game, but unfortunately the level's overall linearity and delineation from one another keep this an arm's length away from that kind of exploration platformer. The controls, however, are tight and responsive, and the blending of platforming, combat, and wild abilities is smooth and intuitive. I will say though, the fact that the roar and enemy pickup functions are contextual and mapped to the same button is frustrating. There are plenty of buttons on the DS to separate those abilities, and I occasionally ran into problems due to this design choice. On the audiovisual front, Where the Wild Things Are is a marvel. Stages are themed uniquely with bright colors and exclusive enemy units that pose similar but appropriately diverse challenges. The pixel work is outstanding, especially on backgrounds and environmental elements. The music by Stephen Gearing is just as stunning. Though I like the soundtrack in the console version, I'd say this one's even better. The DS game also pays its own tributes to the film, much like its console cousin. The aforementioned fort building aside, KW's wild ability to put Max in her mouth and walk through caustic areas mimics a scene in the movie where Max climbs in her mouth to hide from a rampaging Carol. The early plot point about the death of the son is also a reference to the film.
Carol, did you know the son was gonna die?
What?
Coming in at about 4 hours for a reasonably complete playthrough, the DS version is certainly slimmer than its big brother, and similarly poses little challenge to a seasoned player. But if you're looking for something low intensity and relaxing that you can knock out in a few hours, both versions of the game have something to offer for a lazy weekend afternoon. As a complete gaming experience, the DS version is tighter and more robust, but if you want something a bit more emotional and artsy, the console version evokes a lot of the same qualities as Spike Jonze's very gentle and heartfelt film. Maurice Sendak once sent an original drawing of a wild thing to a boy in response to his fan letter. The child's mother wrote back and said her son loved the drawing so much that he ate it. The author said it was one of the highest compliments he'd ever received. Where the Wild Things Are is my favorite children's book. I often credit it as the earliest seed for making me want to pursue the arts as a career. There's something so timeless about those disproportionate characters rendered in muted watercolors and defined in scratchy inks. I adore Spike Jonze's film for its matured perspective on the themes of the book. And as descendants of those things, I have a hard time not enjoying these imperfect games for allowing me to spend just a few more hours with these lifelong friends. I can't say that I adored these movie tie-ins enough to literally ingest them, but as for Sendak's original masterpiece, I understand where the kid was coming from. I'll eat it up, I love it so.